This is Daniel Kahneman, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his work on prospect theory, which explains how people make decisions when the stakes are high and the outcome is uncertain, like when they gamble or invest in the stock market. His book, Thinking Fast and Slow, introduces two systems that govern our brain's decision-making process. Our brain's System 1 operates fast, instinctively, and emotionally, while our brain's System 2 is slow, rational, and logical. And so, these two systems work together to help us navigate through life. But they can also trick us into making bad decisions sometimes. So, here are 8 ways your brain tricks you, according to the Daniel Kahneman. Welcome to the channel. Number 1, availability heuristic. One way our brain tricks us is through something called the availability heuristic. This refers to our tendency to estimate the likelihood of an event based on how easily we can recall similar events from our memory. For example, after watching a few news reports about airplane crashes, you may start to feel anxious about flying, even though it's statistically one of the safest modes of transportation. That is because your brain is overestimating the likelihood of a crash, because you can easily recall those news reports, which makes it seem more likely than it actually is. Likewise, if you hear a story about a shark attack at a beach, you might avoid going there, even though the chances of being attacked by a shark are extremely low. That is because you're overestimating the likelihood of such an attack, because you can easily recall that one story you heard about. In other words, your brain uses availability as a shortcut to make quick decisions. But this heuristic can lead to cognitive biases and irrational beliefs, so it's important to be aware of it. Number 2, framing effect. Another way our brain tricks us is through the framing effect. This is our tendency to make different decisions based on how the same information is presented to us. For example, research shows that people are more likely to buy a product that is described as 90% fat-free instead of 10% fat, even though they mean the same thing. Even though logically we understand that both statements are saying the same thing, our brains process them differently because of the way they're framed. The first statement highlights what's missing, fat, while the second one highlights what's present, fat-free. And this matters because our brains are wired to focus on losses rather than gains. So the framing effect can influence our decisions in subtle ways. Number 3, loss aversion. Speaking of which, our brains also trick us through loss aversion. This is our tendency to feel the pain of a loss more strongly than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. For example, if you're playing a game where you have to choose between gaining $100 or losing $100, you're more likely to choose the first option, even though both are equally valuable. That is because the pain of losing $100 feels more intense than the pleasure of gaining the same amount. And this is hardwired into our brains as a survival mechanism. Losing something means going back to zero, which could be dangerous. So it makes sense that our brains would try to prevent us from losing things. But this bias can also lead to bad decisions. For example, it can make us hold on to losing investments for too long because we do not want to admit that we've lost money. Number 4, mental accounting. Our brain also tricks us through mental accounting, which is our tendency to categorize money differently depending on how we earned it or how we plan to spend it. For example, you might have separate bank accounts for different purposes like a checking account for everyday expenses, a savings account for emergencies, and a retirement account for, well, retirement. And each of these accounts has its own set of rules and constraints. For example, you might treat your checking account as disposable income, your savings account as a safety buffer, and your retirement account as a long-term investment. But these are just mental categories that your brain has created. They don't have any real value. By doing this, you're essentially giving different values to the same unit of currency, which can lead to poor financial decisions. For example, you might be willing to spend money from your checking account, but not from your savings account, even though they both represent disposable income. Number 5. Sunk cost fallacy. Our brains also trick us through the sunk cost fallacy, which is our tendency to continue investing in something simply because we've already invested in it, even if it's no longer a good idea. For example, let's say you bought a stock a year ago and it's lost 50% of its value, but you keep holding on to it because you're hoping that it will go up next week, and you don't want to admit that you've lost money. Well, that's the sunk cost fallacy. You're letting your past investment influence your future decisions instead of making new decisions based on the current situation. And this fallacy can apply to more than just finances. It can affect relationships, careers, projects, and anything else where you've invested time, effort, or money. Number 6. Endowment effect. Another way our brain tricks us is through the endowment effect. This is our tendency to overvalue things that we already own simply because we own them. For example, let's say you bought a t-shirt a week ago, and now someone is offering to trade it with you for a hoodie that you've always wanted. You might refuse that trade even if the hoodie is worth more than the t-shirt, because you don't want to part with something that you already have. That's the endowment effect. You're giving extra value to the t-shirt just because you own it. And this bias can affect our willingness to negotiate or compromise on things. For example, if you're selling a product online and someone offers you a lower price than you're asking for, you might still refuse that offer even if it's reasonable, because you don't want to sell it for less than you originally asked for. Number 7. Status quo bias. Our brain also tricks us through the status quo bias, which is our tendency to stick with the default option even if it's not the best one for us. For example, let's say you're enrolled in a retirement plan at work and you're asked to choose how much to invest. You might just stick with the default percentage, even if it's not optimal for your situation. Or if you're given the option to switch to a new phone plan that might save you money, you might not bother to switch unless it's an extremely good deal. That's the status quo bias. You're giving extra weight to the default option just because it's the default option. And this bias can affect our choices in many areas of life, from politics to insurance to technology. And number 8, anchoring bias. Finally, our brain tricks us through anchoring bias, which is our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we see when making decisions. So those are 8 ways your brain tricks you. According to Daniel Kahneman, do you think you're guilty of any of these biases? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends and family. Thanks for watching. See you next time.